delighted to be hosted here at Hampstead Synagogue, and we're very honoured to welcome Rabbi Dr. Michael Harris to be interviewed about Rabbi Sacks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You knew Rabbi Sacks for such a long time.
So Rabbi Sacks was kind of always there on the near horizon throughout my teen years, and then had the privilege of getting to talk to him more when my interest went into areas that interested him, and then to work under him when he was chief rabbi. You know, statistically, we are a very small community, some 300,000 in a population of some 50 million, and we could just be a negligible, inward-looking faith community. But Rabbi Sacks always made sure that that wasn't the case in his writings, in broadcasts, and so on.
The tent at St. Ethelburga's represents a belief that Britain is richer for its religious diversity. And yet there are some who question this, suggesting that for our society to flourish, minorities must be willing not only to integrate, but to assimilate. I think the story of Britain's Jews proves otherwise.
How did other thinkers strike that balance?
So I think that Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in 19th century Germany, Rav Kook, of course, in Eastern Europe, and then in pre-state Israel, they had their combinations of Torah and secular wisdom, each in their own way. Actually, Rabbi Sacks analyzes, devotes quite a lot of space to discussing, as it were, his predecessors on the path of Torah and secular knowledge in works like Tradition in an Untraditional Age. But he had his own way of combining them, which he called Torah v'chokhmah. Although he was trained in analytic philosophy, he's not restricted to that, and he is always engaging with the full range of humanities, sciences, and so on, really the whole panoply of chokhmah.
Judaism really is a religion that takes its stand alongside Richard Dawkins. We value the integrity of science. We value an evidence-based approach to natural phenomena. We make a blessing over seeing distinguished scientists. Maimonides says, if you want to come to the love and fear of God, study science.
To what extent do you think we can classify Rabbi Sacks as a philosopher?
I think he is definitely accurately classed as a Jewish philosopher, as an important Jewish philosopher, but to call him a philosopher is almost too narrow.
He's often called a public intellectual.
Yeah, he has very clear positions on many issues of Jewish moment and on issues of pluralism, relativism, and so on. But the method is almost as important, to reach out to philosophy, to literature, to music, to art, and show that the Torah in its broader sense has something relevant to contribute to that conversation. I think that is something very important. Actually, something that Daniel Reinhold emphasized in the introduction to Radical Responsibility, that much of the history of Jewish philosophy has been about defending Jewish belief or practice from external systems of thought which appeared to threaten it. So, for example, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, in the case of Aristotelianism, and much later Moses Mendelssohn in the face of Enlightenment thought. But what Rabbi Sacks showed in so many ways was that Judaism doesn't have to be stuck in that defensive posture, and it can enter profitably issues in the wider world and contribute to the discussion in the wider world and to the broader outlook.
You know, people sometimes confuse two words, the word optimism and the word hope. I think they're completely different. Optimism is the belief that the world is going to get better. Hope is the belief that if we work hard enough together, we can make the world better. It needs no courage, only a certain naivety to be an optimist. But it demands a very great deal of courage indeed to have hope. No Jew, knowing the history of our people, can be an optimist. But no Jew worthy of the name ever lost hope.
So, in the field that you've written about a lot, in the problem of evil, How would you say that you've kind of integrated between evil in the analytical, philosophical sense and Jewish approaches to evil?
I think that in order to come up with something plausible in dealing with this incredibly difficult problem of the tension between traditional Jewish belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing and perfectly good God on the one hand, and the existence and range and depth of suffering in the world on the other. Rabbi Sacks actually has a very distinctive approach to this issue, which I think puts him in a definite tradition of Jewish philosophy. It's that the very attempt to try and find a satisfactory theoretical answer to the problem of evil is misguided because, as I think he puts it in one essay in Covenant and Conversation, if we understood fully the reason that God permits evil in the world, that would undermine our motivation to fight it. He does explore some other approaches in one of the chapters of his book on Judaism and Science. He has a whole chapter devoted to it, but I think his strongest feeling about the problem of evil is in that tradition of anti-theodicy, which we associate with Rav Soloveitchik and with some other post-Holocaust Jewish theologians and thinkers.
There are religions of acceptance. It's God's will. We have to live with it. There are religions of comfort. It'll all be okay in another life. And there are religions of protest. And Judaism really is a religion of protest. And somehow or other, evil pains God as much as it pains us. And he calls out to us, help me eliminate evil from the human heart, because that's the one thing you have to do. I can't do it for you. And Jewish faith has been that sustained craziness of 4,000 years saying, no, we are not going to accept, and no, we are not going to be consoled. We are going to fight for a world in which there is less evil and less suffering. Now that's an unusual religion.
And we know with Rav Soloveitchik, one of the main philosophical schools of thought that influenced him was existentialism. How did that influence Rabbi Sacks?
One of the things which I think is obvious and which always strikes me in thinking about Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Sacks together is simply the contrast between their foci of main interest. Rabbi Soloveitchik is interested in the individual, primarily, as you can see from many of the titles of his works, Halachic Man, Lonely Man of Faith. Rabbi Sacks, while having much of great value to say, what is it to have a shared morality in a society, what is it to build an economic system, what would it be for a modern Jewish state to live out the values that are there in the Torah regarding how we run a society from an economic and other points of view. That's something that he felt should be central to the agenda of religious Zionism, but which he felt wasn't, and I dare say still isn't central to religious Zionist thought. But I think he would want to know how Torah values on a whole range of public issues would contribute to the running of society. So another example would be the environment. How do we live out those values in the Torah, not destroying trees when besieging in war, the halakha of not wasting natural resources? How would those translate into a contemporary environmental policy in a modern state? So that would be another area in which this model could be applied. In terms of the culture of debate and discussion, have such a, he always stressed what a rich questioning culture we have in rabbinic literature and the Talmud and so on. How would we live that out in terms of free speech and the tone of debate within a contemporary Jewish polity within the state of Israel? So I think there's, really on every major public issue, there are resources in the Torah which we can apply with benefit to real contemporary problems.
In a society where perhaps agreement is so rare, how can you engage in constructive dialogue?
I think he was fearless about conversing across the spectrum. In typical Rabbi Sacks fashion, he takes a particular Torah text and applies it to the most serious problems of our contemporary world.
Okay, and this brings us to the issue of interpretation, the role of the interpreter. I think that he definitely agreed with the idea of the act of interpretation as being an ethical act, which has potentially ethical and moral implications for broader society, for the individual. What did he do with hard texts?
He says that all religions, all faiths have their difficult texts, by which he means texts which apparently throw up moral problems. I'll give illustrations in a second. But by the time he gets to Not in God's Name, later book, it's quite clear that there isn't really a choice, and that these texts have to be dealt with in a way which doesn't break the link between religion and most cherished ethical commitments, but which does break the link between religion and violence. One would be the commandment of wiping out Amalek, a war from generation to generation against Amalek. Then later on in Deuteronomy, in the Siddur of Kitetse, the Torah gives us an actual command to remember what Amalek did, and Timchet Zecha Amalek, to wipe out the memory of Amalek.
So why would that be a hard text?
So, on the face of it, it is a commandment to carry out the extermination of a whole people down through the ages, and regardless of whether those people were those who participated in the cowardly original attack on Israel or not. So he talks about how the Torah itself and Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible afterwards, emphasizes peace. V'natati shalom ba'aretz, one of the greatest blessings is God giving peace in the world. The beautiful vision in Yeshaya, in Isaiah, of destroying weapons of war and turning them into agricultural tools to foster peaceful human culture and looking after people's basic needs, and the peaceful vision of the Messianic age in the book of Isaiah. So broader biblical values. He says, look at those as the basic values, and the apparently morally difficult commandments as the exceptions which need to be explained in light of the broader biblical values. So that's one approach.
Why did Moses tell the Israelites, in effect, to forgive the Egyptians, but not the Amalekites? The answer, I think, is to be found as a corollary of the famous teaching in Pirkei Avot, Kol ahava hatluya badavar. Whenever love depends on a cause, and the cause disappears, the love disappears also. But if love doesn't depend on a cause, then the love will never pass away.
Secondly, he draws our attention, as other thinkers do, to the Torah Sheba'al Peh, to Jewish oral tradition. So, it's a fundamental of Orthodox belief that we don't take the Torah at face value, we interpret it through the lens of the oral tradition and rabbinic tradition. And rabbinic tradition has consistently addressed these morally difficult commandments and rendered them sometimes inoperable on a practical level. So, for example, we have the principle in the Mishnah that King Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, mixed up all the nations, so we're no longer able to identify the ethnicity of anyone, and therefore that makes the wiping out of the seven nations impossible. The third thing he says, which I haven't seen in the work of other thinkers, is that there is a return to prophetic values in the early centuries of the Common Era. So again, in Not in Heaven, Rabbi Sacks cites a famous Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat, in Tractate Shabbat, where there is a machloket, there's a given difference of opinion among the rabbis as to whether someone can go out with weapons of war on Shabbat, and the halakha follows the opinion that weapons of war are considered to be a disgrace, they're considered to be something very negative, they're not a tachshit, they're not an ornament, and therefore they can't be taken out on Shabbat. And what Rabbi Sacks argues is that after the military struggles against Rome and so on, when we get into the later Mishnaic and Talmudic eras, there is a return to the values of Isaiah and other prophets who try to diminish the scope of military activity as much as possible and focus on dealing with evil and with threats in other ways. And he also, strikingly, isn't frightened to apply that, to turn the lens, as it were, the microscope on our own Jewish community and our own state of Israel.
And we know from the story of Noah and the ark that a righteous individual on his own can save himself and his family, but not the society in which he lives, unless he transforms the society in which he lives. Taken collectively, the commands of the Torah are prescription for the construction of a society with the consciousness of God at its center. God asks the Jewish people to become a role model for humanity by the shape and texture of the society they build, a society characterized by justice and the rule of law, welfare and concern for the poor, the marginal, and the vulnerable, and a society in which all would have equal dignity under the sovereignty of God.
You've written a book with Professor Daniel Reihold about the gifts, I suppose, of Nietzsche to Jewish thought, including to Rav Soloveitchik. What did Rabbi Sachs think of that?
I think Rabbi Sachs probably disagreed very strongly. Nietzsche is something of a bête noire for him. He mentions Nietzsche many times in passing, and Daniel Reinhold and I disagree. Undoubtedly, Nietzsche was a trenchant atheist, and his views on morality are very complex because the Judaism is not ascetic. It embraces the physical world to the extent that halakha allows. It is life-affirming, and it is strong, and it is creative. Nietzschean values, strength and creation, life-affirmingness. And despite the hugely disparate starting points of traditional Judaism and Nietzsche, not least on the question of the existence of God itself, we believe that there is something to speak about there, and it's worth bringing them into conversation. Close to the beginning of the book, we actually have one of Rabbi Sachs's anti-Nietzsche quotes and explain that we're going to be thoroughly disagreeing with that position throughout the book. With typical generosity, Rabbi Sachs wrote me a most beautiful message about the broadening of intellectual horizons, and that was really lovely and just typical of him, to be almost saying, well, look, I can't see anything in Nietzsche, but if you can and you can persuade other Jewish people that there's something there, then that's great. Mm-hmm. So apart from Nietzsche, Rabbi Sachs often seems to advocate the thesis that being religious is more likely to make you a moral person. Which Avi Sagi of Bar-Ilan and Daniel Statman talk about as, they call it weak dependence, that morality is weakly dependent on religion, in other words, not logically dependent on religion, but being religious in some way is more likely to make you a moral person. In his writings, he seems to think there's some kind of closer bonds between religion or divine command and morality.
According to the extensive research carried out by Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam, today in America and here in Britain, regular worshippers are more likely than others to give to charity, regardless of whether that charity is religious or secular, do voluntary work, give money to a homeless person, donate blood, help a neighbor with the housework, spend time with someone who's feeling depressed, and or help someone find a job. They're more active citizens, significantly more likely to belong to community organizations and neighborhood groups. They get involved, turn up, and lead. I do not say for a moment that to be good, you need to be religious. But religiosity, as measured by attendance at a house of worship, turns out to be a better predictor of altruism and empathy than education, age, income, gender, or race.
Thank you very much for having us here.
It's a great pleasure and wonderful, Miriam, to talk to you about Rabbi Sachs in our beautiful sanctuary, which he graced on so many occasions. Thank you.